Hello, welcome to The Psychic and the Pastor, but in this case, it's not a psychic. He talks about that. He is in that ministry of reaching out to those people who are engaged in the psychic, false spirituality. And his name is Don Veinot. Did I pronounce it right, Don?
Close enough for government work.
Close enough, Don. Okay, and you're located where?
Wonder Lake, Illinois is our main headquarters. We also have an office in Florida and in southern Illinois.
And the name of your ministry is Midwest Christian Outreach.
Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc.
Okay, well, thank you for being on the program with us. And we're going to be talking a great deal about the Enneagram because you've written a book about that with your wife Joy and Marcia Montenegro, which we have filmed 4 different programs, maybe 4 or 6 programs with Marcia, and the name of your book is Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, and it was given to me to read. I wanted to know about Enneagram, and I thought, wow, this is such an important book, and I wanted to make sure that people are able to get it and read this book. But we're going to start back in your background, Don. What was your early family involvement? Was there any Christianity in it at all?
You know, that's a really good question. My father was an atheist. He wasn't a philosophical atheist. It isn't that he thought it through that much. He simply denied God, and it allowed him to live pretty much the way he wanted to live. And he had married my mother. She was quite young when they married, and he forbid her from going to church. So I had really no Christian upbringing. I knew a few Christians. On occasion, I might go to church with one of my friends, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And they didn't seem to live any differently than I did, so there was no compelling reason to even consider Christianity at that time. Evolution obviously was the thing that was taught in school in my growing up years, which excludes God from the equation pretty much. And I believe that. And,
where'd you grow up?
Kind of all over. We never really lived anywhere more than about a year or 2. My father moved a lot, so I grew up in various parts of the country: California, Las Vegas, Missouri, New York. Kind of traveled around, so that was interesting. Hard to make friends for a very long time, but you did get to see different parts of the country. My parents were divorced when I was coming into my teens. My mother was pretty involved in what is now called the New Age. At the time, it really wasn't called that. Her favorite author was Edgar Cayce. One of her best friends was a witch, and she would go and get her fortune told fairly frequently. So I had kind of an eclectic upbringing. Met a young lady when I was 15. She was a Christian, but was slightly backslidden, let's say. She shouldn't have dated me. She did. I'm glad she did. She shouldn't have married me for sure. I'm really glad she did that. What we didn't know is her grandfather, as well as her parents, but especially her grandfather, was praying for me from the time we met until I became a Christian 6 years later. And his prayer was that I would become a Christian and that I would become a pastor. And to that end, while he was praying, he was also buying commentaries and Bibles and other things that pastors would need and just storing them away. We didn't know any of this. We married, and 3 years later we had our son. And Joy woke up in the hospital with 2 big questions. One is, how could they send this child home with me? I don't know anything about raising children. So she was a little afraid of that. Secondly, what am I going to teach him? I need to teach him something. And so she kind of challenged God, if you're real, show yourself to me. And he did in some interesting ways, part of which brought her in contact with some books that her sister was reading. And she then asked me if I would read them, because she recommitted her life to Christ, but she's married to an atheist. Now, that's not going to work out well in the end. And I had learned a few things about her over the 6 years we had been together, and one of which is if she really wants something, she's going to get it anyway. So it's just easier to give in early. So when she asked me to read this material, I said, okay. I figured I'll read it. I'll be able to refute it. I haven't met very many Christians that can make a reasonable defense of the faith. And so I read it. And I came to several realizations as I was doing that. First, I couldn't really be an atheist and be honest. There was a conflict because atheism was a claim to know something that I really couldn't know. I couldn't know that God doesn't exist somewhere or hasn't existed in the past or may exist in the future. I would really have to be God to know that. So that didn't really work. But I thought I could be an agnostic. That seemed pretty comfortable. You don't have to claim anything. You can just say, I don't know. And there's two kinds of agnostics, as my friend, the late Dr. Norm Geisler, would say. There's an honorary agnostic and an ordinary agnostic. An honorary agnostic says, there is no God, so leave me alone. An ordinary agnostic says, I don't think there's a God, but I'm open to information. And I was both. And so I was unsatisfied, though, because just saying I don't know is insufficient for me. It might be for somebody else, but not for me. And I continued pursuing it, and I started then discovering other things. The Bible is fundamentally reliable. Maybe not inspired, but fundamentally reliable. The text we have in our hands today is 99.9% what was originally penned. And we have a lot of manuscript evidence to prove that. So that's a pretty powerful claim. At least it tells me the information I'm looking at is reliable information. Maybe not true, but at least reliable. And as I pursued that, I had to come to grips with some other things along the way. The chief one being this. There's this guy, his name's Jesus. He was born a couple thousand years ago, and he made some really amazing claims. He claimed to be God. That's pretty amazing if it's true. There are others who might make a similar claim, and it's definitely not true. So how would I verify that? The reaction of the Jewish leaders at the time demonstrated they knew what he was claiming. That still doesn't mean it was true. What cinched it for me on that question was the resurrection. If the resurrection is true, then he is who he claimed to be. He predicted he would die. He predicted he would then raise himself from the dead, John 2:19 and following. He did die, and then, by all accounts, he raised himself from the dead. The apostles clearly believed it. The early believers clearly believed it. Evidence outside the Bible by those who knew the early believers, Pliny the Younger and others, documented what they believed. So that seemed to argue that Christianity is fundamentally true. That still doesn't mean inspired Word of God. It just means fundamentally true.
So now, how old are you, Don, when you're reading all this? What?
Early 20s, 21, 22.
Early 20s.
Early 20s.
Okay. Yeah. Were you attending a church at all?
We had not started attending church at that point in time. I was still kind of sorting this out. The inspiration of Scripture came from, again, Jesus. He equated, in fact, he talks about this several times. He points back to the Old Testament. He talks about it being the Word of God. He considered it inspired by God. And in fact, he elevated his own word to equal to that of the Word of God. And we see that in Matthew 5, for example. You've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say, in the next words then, he's elevating them equal to what the Old Testament had written, coming from God to Moses. I say, if you look at a woman with lust in your eye, you've committed the act. So he clearly, and he affirmed the very issues that are denied by, say, liberals. He confirmed Adam and Eve. He confirmed Noah's flood. He confirmed, the big issues that liberals want to deny Noah. He affirmed all of those. So I embraced inspiration because of this guy who claimed to be God, said he would raise himself from the dead, and then did raise himself from the dead. I thought, well, it's a safe bet. If he believes in inspiration, I'm just going to follow that lead. And it hasn't let me down since then. Church became another kind of an issue because Joy and I, she recommitted her life to Christ. I became a believer. We shortly went and saw her best friend who wasn't a believer at the time. And what was funny is that night We were there at their apartment, and Joy and I are talking to her, trying to give her the gospel, and she's acting kind of like she's trying to do the same thing to us, and then we discover that she had become a believer at the same time. And so the place went up for grabs. Over the next month or two, several of our friends came to the faith. We started a Bible study, which was, if you think about it in retrospect, silly, because I didn't know anything about the Bible, but here I'm leading a Bible study. We never got out of the book of John, the first chapter of the book of John, because every week somebody would become a believer. And so Joy and I said, we need to go to a church. We need to find someplace where they know something about the Bible. And so we looked around and we said, well, she said a Baptist church. Baptists are good. We didn't realize there are over 60 kinds of Baptists, and some of them are not so good. And so we walked into this church of
Baptists?
About 50. There were maybe 15 or 20 of us. Go ahead.
60. I think the last time I said that, I'm a Baptist, by the way. I'm pastor of a Baptist church in my 39th year, and I thought for a while there was about 30, but you say 60. I believe that.
Yeah, 60. Yeah, and we've also discovered since then that you're not really a Baptist church unless you split at least once. So
yeah.
There is that. But we walked into this church, about 15 or 20 of us, I think, and a church of about 50, and they were like, well, where did you come from? So we explained it, and we tried to settle in. It was an independent fundamentalist Baptist church, and their big things were making sure you get really wet. That was really important. Well, baptism was very important.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Right. So you have the 12 steps to baptism, 12 steps after baptism. Everything revolves around getting the person wet. We ran into a problem after being there for a little while because my wife and I both have a problem with independent thinking, and that was simply not tolerated. And so at one point, they asked me to leave the church in the middle of the service. So at that point, we thought, okay, we're done with this church thing. It's just not working out for us. And my sister-in-law had paid for us to go to a retreat, didn't tell us. She just did it because she was concerned about that scenario. And she said, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to go to any sessions. I paid for it. Just go there. You can play in the snow. You can do it. So we went. And the speaker was captivating. He spoke about the love of God in a way that I had never heard it before. And it just drew us back in. And that's how we integrated back into the church. A few years later, Joy met some Jehovah's Witnesses on a bowling league. It was a time after the Watchtower's last failed prophecy, 1975, of the world ending. Didn't happen. The Watchtower, because they're losing so many people, allowed the people to get a little involved socially, and so these women joined a women's bowling league, a scratch league. They called it the Hot Tomato League. And Joy and I are avid bowlers. We'd bowl 4 nights a week, pretty much. And so she started bowling with them and came home. She goes, I really love these women. They're funny. They're, great mothers. But they're Jehovah's Witnesses, and I don't really know what they believe, so I need to figure it out. Can you help me? Now remember, if Joy wants something really badly, it's easier to give it early because she's going to get it anyway. And so I said, okay, let's do what we have to do. So we went to our pastor first, and he looked at us puzzled. Said, I don't really know about Jehovah's Witnesses. And he gave us a little tract. Had a lot of Bible verses in it. Didn't tell us why they're important. It just had the Bible verses. And so we were still befuddled. And it became that Joy and I became drawn to the search. What do they believe and why do they believe it? In the process, we actually learned why we're supposed to believe what we believe. It's not commonly taught in the church, frankly. Most churches have a really fine doctrinal statement, and most members sign the doctrinal statement, but few of them actually could defend it if they were sitting with a Jehovah's Witness. So we learned about that. And by, Joy wanted to still reach them, was looking for opportunities, and said, with all this knowledge, I think we can do something more. And so she had heard about a ministry, pretty simple ministry, pre-recorded telephone line. And so you would write a message, 3 to 5 minutes. You'd advertise it in the area newspapers. You don't answer the phone. You just let them call and listen to the message. And so she did that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's good because it'll keep her busy. I was building my business, had no intention of becoming a missionary. I could support her endeavor. She'd be happy. I'd be happy. I'll become a rich general contractor and support missionaries. That was my goal. I didn't want to be one. And so over time, several others had opened a pre-recorded helpline. Then we converted ours to a live line. We started getting calls literally from all over the country because the pre-recorded lines would refer them to us. In late 1994, we said, okay, we need to start something a little more official because we started getting phone calls about other groups. The International Churches of Christ had just started and had come to the Chicago area. We're getting calls about Mormons. We're getting calls about a guy named Bill Gothard. In 1995, we founded Midwest Christian Outreach. That's how that started. And over the years, it has just grown. We are really what we are is missionaries to cults and non-Christian religions. We spend a great deal of our time with Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or going to New Age fairs where we hang around with angel channelers and psychics, or the Parliament of the World's Religions where you have 8,000 or 10,000 religions from around the world represented in one location, and it is an evangelist dream to be there. It's just great. So that's who we are. That's where we got involved. Unfortunately, along the way, because of issues like Bill Gothard, for example, we had to start looking into false teachers in the church. We didn't want to do that. It's hard to raise missionary support if you're picking on favorite teachers within the church. And yet, it seems to me Acts 20:28 and following is clear. The first task of a pastor, Christian leader, is to guard the flock. If we're not doing that, missionary work kind of fails because you're not doing your first job, which is guarding the flock.
Don, let me stop you on this. What you just said is so vital. I've been a pastor for a little over 52 years now. And what you just said, I completely agree with. The pastor's job is to protect the flock. And the pastor, the shepherd, has a shepherd's crook to fight off the wolves. And that's what I find missing in so many churches today is not looking after the flock and the attacks that go on. Anyway, I'm glad to hear you say that. Anyway, go on, Don, go on.
Well, it's really important because at the time we had to ask ourselves a question as we started looking into the Bill Gothard issue. Our senior researcher, Ron Hensel, we had met him. He had just come out of a psychological cult, a Christian psychology cult, actually. And we asked him to be our senior researcher. And he and I started looking at Bill Gothard's material because initially we thought his followers have to just be misunderstanding him and misusing it based on what we were hearing. And as we started reading it, and I had been to one of the seminars, one night of one of the seminars only, we thought legalistic, but orthodox as far as we knew, and had big recommendations from celebrity pastors again. But it appears that no one actually looked into what he's teaching. He's used the right terminology, but he would give different definitions, we discovered. Grace, for example, if I ask you what's the definition of grace is, what would you say?
God's gift.
God's gift. Unmerited favor, right?
Unmerited favor.
The long version is a kindly attitude toward the undeserving. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Unmerited favor. Okay. He gives a very different definition, and he does it in the first night of his seminar. He says that grace is God giving you the power and ability to do his will joyfully. Now, he may give you the power and ability to do his will joyfully, but that's not grace. So he's just redefined grace, and then as he builds on that, other things begin skewing along the way. So we had asked ourselves, do we want to tackle this or do we not? We didn't want to because it just is an unpopular thing to do. It's easy if you're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, everyone goes, yeah, they're the bad guys. When you talk about a false teacher in the church, they want to go, he's my guy, he's okay. And so we knew that was a potential problem, but it still seemed like it had to be done for the reasons that you and I just talked about. Our chief task as leaders in the church is to guard the flock. The second task, or maybe equal to it, is the pastoral epistles, is to train the flock, equip the flock to do the work of ministry. Those two things.
Exactly right. The word equipping is right there. I agree. That's what we do. That's what we do, Don.
Right. So we spent 6 years trying to correct Bill Gothard. We had 40 different scholars watching what we were doing as we wrote our book about him, to make sure that we were being fair, accurate, that it was being corrected, and then that came out.
Yeah.
So that's how we got started.
That's how you got started. Now, so the outreach to Enneagram, the Richard Rohr, and so on. But how long ago did you start engaging in that, Don?
Well, that's kind of funny. Joy and I knew about the Enneagram in 1992 because an acquaintance of ours, Father Mitch Pacwa, he's a Jesuit priest. He was in Chicago at the time, had written a book about the Enneagram. He wrote about Jungian psychology, the Enneagram, and other things. He's got 2 chapters in his book on the Enneagram. But we read it. This was 1992. We said, oh, that's interesting. It's really weird, but we'll never have to deal with that in the evangelical church. I mean, we actually have people that read the Bible, right?
Don, it occurs to me that many people watching our program are not even understanding what we're saying with Enneagram, and I'm glad you have the book cover up. Enneagram, Enne, it's from the Greek, and it means 9. And it means 9, right. And the last part is
Rama,
which
means something written or drawn.
Yes, written or drawn, and it's a drawing. It's a drawing. It's a strange thing. We're gonna talk about that more in the second program, the one's coming up. For those watching, this is our first program with Don, and the second program we're going to go more thoroughly into the Enneagram. And so you started with Bill Gothard. What was the other title to Bill Gothard's ministry?
Originally it was the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts.
Basic Youth Conflicts, that's it.
Conflicts, right. And he was kind of the original, you can't buy this in stores guy. You had to go to his seminars to get his materials. He was actually filling out stadiums. He started in 1964. But around 1970, he was filling stadiums with his seminar. One lone guy with an overhead projector saying the problem with our culture today is authority. And folks were just flocking to his seminars, especially parents sending their kids, because they were terrified by what we were seeing in culture. I mean, you and I were probably similar in age, and we'll remember the raucous 1960s and 70s a little bit. He starts out saying the problem is authority. Well, okay, there's a problem with authority for sure. But then he goes on to say what the Bible teaches is that there's an umbrella of protection. If you're under the umbrella, you are protected. And that's the umbrella of authority. If you get out from under the umbrella, you are in rebellion, and rebellion is as a sin of witchcraft. And so it becomes a very legalistic belief system. But it sounds credible because he gives Bible passages that seem to support what he's saying. They don't. He talks about the Roman centurion, for example, that comes to Jesus. His servant is sick, and Jesus is going to go and heal him. And he says, no, you don't have to do that because I, too, am a man under authority. And so now the story becomes about authority. No, it's not a story about authority. It's a story about Jesus. Jesus can heal long distance. That's what the story's about, right?
Don, let me stop you here. Back in the 1970s, I was pastor of a church, and it was about, I would say, 300 people from about the ages of about 18 to 30. We had a member of our church who was a very wealthy man. He paid everybody's tuition for going to the basic youth conflicts.
Right.
And it heavily impacted our church and did a great deal to harm it. And so I had kind of forgotten about him. And there exists in the church, the Christian church, the followers of Jesus, no matter what denomination, are always under attack.
Right.
Always under attack. 1 Peter 5:8. The devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And in many ways, this is our outreach. This is our ministry, Don,
Right.
is to come after and identify and oppose that which is destructive and false. And it is a very rough ministry, and there are not many engaged in it anymore. I've noticed that disappear.
It's you got to have thick skin, and fortunately, I'm not easily cowed, which is helpful to me. I have a phrase I have to tell folks that are just coming into a ministry like this. I just had to do this with a former New Ager because she was being assaulted by many. And I called her and I said, okay, here's something you need to learn. This is very important. This is level 1 material. Just because someone invites you to a gunfight doesn't mean you have to show up. You don't have to defend yourself. You have to carry out what God has called you to do. Focus on that, and everything else will take care of itself. So that's what you're doing. That's what we do, the same thing.
Yeah.
So this issue of authority is a real thorn because it brings people into this very legalistic idea of life. Everything is a principle, some command, some law, something that you have to do, and you wake up every morning figuring out, did I do my whole checklist of everything I have to obey? And when we met with him the first time, because we did meet with him a number of times, and I raised this issue, I said, okay, you tell us that authority is an umbrella protection. If you're under the umbrella, you're protected. If you get out from under the umbrella, you are in rebellion, and rebellion is a sin of witchcraft. Is that correct? He goes, yes. I said, okay. And then, same night, a little later, you tell us that the only story we have about Jesus in his childhood is at the age of 12 when he remained behind, and then his parents had to come back frantically looking for him, and he, according to you, had to make the tough decision to get back under his parents' umbrella of protection. Now, that would mean necessarily he got out from under the umbrella to begin with. Getting out from under the umbrella is rebellion. Rebellion is a sin of witchcraft. So how could he die for our sins if he himself is a sinner? He didn't have a response. It says, so either your teaching is wrong or Jesus is a sinner. It can't really be both. And he thought about it for a few minutes, and he said, no, my teaching is right, and Jesus isn't a sinner, but he could never explain why. And things essentially went downhill from there. So that was the bill. We ended up doing a book about him, Matter of Basic Principles, Bill Gothard and the Christian Life.
Wow, Don, we're gonna have to close out here and get ready for the next program, but be looking for the second interview with Don Veinot, I think. Don Veinot back in Illinois and his outreach. We're going to be spending a lot of time on the Enneagram, and we'll explain it all to you. So long.